The state and defense ready for trial this morning.
Yes, Your Honor. Yes.
Before we begin, pause for just 1 second and imagine this. Your phone rings. It's your child. And in the next 60 seconds, everything you thought you know about them, every memory, every moment of pride, will be destroyed forever. What would you do? Would you hang up? Would you report them? Or would you pretend you never heard what they just confessed? Keep that question in your mind, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why one father had to make the most unbearable choice of his life. And if this story shakes you the way it should, hit that subscribe button now, because we tell the stories that others won't, the ones that expose the darkest corners of human nature. Was it that bad, son? 4 words. A father's voice trembling through a jail phone line, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, he'd misunderstood. Maybe his boy, his son, was exaggerating. Maybe this was all some terrible nightmare that would dissolve with the morning light. It was that bad, Dad. Silence. The kind of silence that crushes your chest and makes you forget how to breathe. I ran over her with a car 100 times, you know? Stephen Testaseka sat frozen in his living room in Florida, the phone pressed so hard against his ear it hurt. The voice on the other end belonged to Wade Stephen Wilson, the son he'd raised, the boy he'd watched grow up, the young man who once had so much potential. But the words coming through that phone, those weren't the words of the son he remembered. They were the words of a stranger, a monster. And here's what makes this moment so devastating. Stephen didn't hang up. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. Instead, he asked the question that no parent should ever have to ask. Did you stab that first girl? Did I stab her? No, you choked her. Yeah, I just choked her. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so the blood you had all over you was from the second girl. It might have been? Yeah, either that or it was my own blood because I had climbed a couple fences and stuff like that and I got cut. Listen to that exchange again in your mind. A father and son talking about murder the way most families talk about what happened at work that day. Casual. Detached. Horrifying. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching this from, because no matter where you are in the world, I guarantee you've never heard a conversation quite like this one. And trust me, this is only the beginning. Let me take you back to October 2019. Cape Coral, Florida, a quiet community where people knew their neighbors, where parents felt safe letting their kids play outside. But on the night of October 6th, something evil arrived in Cape Coral, something that would shatter 2 families and leave an entire community asking one question. How could someone do this? Christine Melton was 35 years old. She loved music. She loved life. On that October night, she'd gone out to a local bar, just unwinding, enjoying herself the way thousands of people do every weekend. She met someone there, a young man with a charming smile and easy conversation. They talked. They laughed. And when the night ended, she made a decision that seemed harmless at the time. She let him come back to her place. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you met someone new and felt that instant connection? How many times have you made a snap judgment about whether someone seemed safe, seemed normal, seemed trustworthy? Christine thought she'd made the right call. She had no idea she'd just invited a nightmare through her front door. Back at her home, they hung out for a while. And then, exhausted from the evening, Christine fell asleep. She felt safe in her own home, in her own bed. She had no reason to fear. But while she slept, the man she had trusted was watching her, thinking, planning. And then he moved. Wade Wilson climbed on top of Christine Melton as she slept, and he wrapped his hands around her throat. She, of course, woke up. Can you imagine that moment of confusion, that split second where you don't understand what's happening? And then the terror, the desperate fight for air, the realization that you're going to die and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Christine fought. But it wasn't enough. Her life ended there, in her own bedroom. at the hands of someone she had shown kindness to just hours earlier. But Wade wasn't done, not even close. After killing Christine, he stayed in her house. Just stayed there, walking around, going through her things, as if he had just completed the most ordinary task in the world. He looked at her body and decided he needed to get rid of it. He tried to roll her up and put her in the trunk of her car, but he couldn't lift her. You know what he told his father later? He said he thought rigor mortis had already started to set in, making her body too stiff to move.
Rigor mortis. He knew the term. He'd thought about it. This wasn't some blind rage or momentary loss of control. This was someone who understood exactly what he'd done and was calmly trying to cover it up. When he couldn't move Christine's body, Wade made another decision. He took her car keys and drove away in her vehicle, leaving her body behind like garbage. And as the sun rose over Cape Coral on October 7th, Wade Wilson was already hunting again. Diane Ruiz was 43 years old. She was a mother. She was someone's daughter. She was walking along a roadside that morning, minding her own business, when a car pulled up beside her. The driver rolled down his window. Young guy, friendly. He asked her for directions, and when she stepped closer to help, he asked if she'd like to get in the car and show him the way. Maybe she felt sorry for him. Maybe she was just being kind. Maybe she thought, what harm could it do? She got in the car, Christine Melton's car, and the moment Diane Ruiz closed that door, her fate was sealed. Wade Wilson didn't wait. He didn't drive her anywhere first. He didn't hesitate. While he was driving, he reached over and wrapped his hands around Diane's throat. She fought. She clawed. She tried to escape. But there was nowhere to go, no way out, and eventually her body went limp. Wade thought she was dead. So he drove around looking for a place to dump her body, somewhere remote, somewhere she wouldn't be found right away. When he found a spot, he pulled over, dragged Diane's body out of the car, and tossed her onto the ground. But then something happened that would make this crime even more horrific. Diane moved, just slightly, a breath, a twitch. She was still alive. Now think about this. You're Wade Wilson. You've just strangled someone. You think they're dead. You're about to leave, and then you realize they're still breathing. Most people, even most criminals, would panic. Some might even feel relief, might call for help, might try to undo what they'd done. But Wade Wilson didn't do that. Instead, he got back in the car, aimed it directly at Diane Ruiz, and drove over her body. Then he backed up and drove over her again, and again, and again, over and over, until, in his own words to his father, she looked like spaghetti. If you're feeling sick right now, you should be. If you're feeling angry, heartbroken, horrified, then you're human. And if this story is affecting you, show me by hitting that like button right now, because these victims deserve to have their stories told, and Wade Wilson deserves to have the world know exactly what kind of person he is. Within days, investigators connected the dots. Christine Melton's body was found in her home. Diane Ruiz's remains were discovered on the roadside. Surveillance footage showed Christine's car being driven by a young man with distinctive tattoos. Witnesses came forward. The net was closing. And then came the phone call. Wade Wilson called his father before the police could arrest him. And in that conversation, he confessed everything. Not because he felt guilty, not because he wanted to turn himself in, but because in some twisted way, he seemed proud of what he'd done. He wanted someone to know. He wanted his father to know. Stephen Testasica listened to every word. He asked questions, trying to understand, trying to make sense of something that could never make sense. And when the call ended, Stephen sat in his home, alone, with a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could stay silent, protect his son, pretend he'd never heard the confession, Or he could do the right thing, the impossible thing, and report his own child to the police.
What would you do? Comment below because I need to know. Would you protect your family no matter what they'd done? Or would you choose justice for the victims, even if it meant destroying your own child? Stephen Testaseca made his choice. He picked up the phone, and he called the police. When Wade Wilson was arrested, he showed no emotion, no fear, no remorse. He was calm, almost smiling. And when his father came to visit him in jail, hoping for some sign that his son understood the gravity of what he'd done, Wade's response was chilling. He smirked. He joked. He acted like the whole thing was just another inconvenience. Stephen sat across from his son in that jail visiting room, and he tried. He tried so hard to reach the boy he'd raised. "Everybody in the state thinks you're a monster," Stephen said, his voice breaking. Wade just shrugged. "Yeah." Stephen kept pushing. "You can show them that you have remorse. You can fix this." But Wade wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in fixing anything. He was already somewhere else in his mind, somewhere dark and unreachable. The trial was coming. The evidence was overwhelming. Wade Wilson's own words, recorded on that jail phone call, would be played in open court. His father would have to take the stand and testify against him, and the world would watch as a young man with a charming smile and dead eyes faced the consequences of the evil he'd unleashed. But here's what nobody expected. As the trial approached, something bizarre started happening online. Women, thousands of them, began flooding social media with messages of support for Wade Wilson. They called him attractive. They said they could save him. They romanticized him. And Wade, sitting in jail, waiting to stand trial for 2 brutal murders, seemed to enjoy every second of the attention. He smiled for the cameras. He posed for his mugshots. He acted like he was auditioning for a TV show instead of facing life in prison or the death penalty. The families of Christine Milton and Diane Ruiz watched this circus in horror. Their loved ones were gone. Their lives were shattered. And the man who destroyed them was being treated like a celebrity. How does that happen? How does society lose its way so completely that a confessed killer becomes an object of fascination and desire? Think about that question, because we're going to come back to it. As the trial date arrived, prosecutors prepared their case. They had the jail call. They had surveillance footage. They had witnesses. They had forensic evidence. They had Stephen Testaseca, a father willing to sacrifice his relationship with his son to ensure justice for 2 innocent women. The defense team knew they were facing an uphill battle, so they shifted their strategy. They didn't deny that Wade had killed Christine and Diane. Instead, they argued that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. They brought in experts to talk about brain trauma, substance abuse, mental health issues. They painted a picture of a damaged young man who'd lost control, who couldn't help himself. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They argued that Wade Wilson knew exactly what he was doing. He'd planned his actions. He'd covered his tracks. He'd shown no remorse. And most damning of all, he'd bragged about it to his father in chilling detail. "I ran over her with a car 100 times until she looked like spaghetti." Those words would echo through the courtroom, and they would haunt the jury.
Stephen Testaseca took the stand, and in one of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial, he looked at the jury and told them everything. He recounted the phone call, word for word. He described visiting Wade in jail and seeing nothing but emptiness in his son's eyes. He admitted that Wade had shown no remorse, no humanity, no recognition of the horror he'd caused. And when the prosecutor asked if Wade had used a derogatory term to describe Christine Melton, Stephen's voice cracked as he answered. He said, "I choked that bitch." The courtroom was silent. Some jurors looked down, others wiped away tears. Stephen Testaseca sat on that witness stand and he broke, not because he wanted to hurt his son,
but because he loved those two women he'd never met enough to tell the truth, because he believed they deserved justice more than his son deserved protection. And Wade? He sat at the defense table, watching his father testify against him, and he smirked. Put yourself in that courtroom for just a moment. Imagine being a juror, watching this father sacrifice everything to do the right thing. Imagine being a family member of Christine or Diane, finally seeing someone stand up for your loved one. Now imagine being Stephen, knowing that after this trial, your relationship with your son is over forever, and living with that choice every single day for the rest of your life. The prosecution rested. The defense presented their case, and then it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and said something that cut through all the noise, all the excuses, all the attempts to explain away the inexplicable. Wade Wilson knew what he was doing. He chose to do it, and he felt nothing afterward. The defense countered with pleas for mercy, reminders of Wade's troubled past, suggestions that he deserved life in prison, not death. And then the jury left to deliberate. Hours passed. The families waited. The lawyers waited. Wade waited, looking as relaxed as if he were waiting for a table at a restaurant, and then the jury returned. The four persons stood. The courtroom held its breath, and the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Christine Melton. Guilty. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Diane Ruiz. Guilty. Wade Wilson turned his head slightly, looked toward the gallery where cameras were rolling, and he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a smile of relief or resignation, a genuine, almost playful smile, as if this were all just a game, and he'd already won some private victory that nobody else could understand. But the game wasn't over. Not yet. Because now the same jury had to decide whether Wade Wilson would spend the rest of his life in prison or whether he would be sentenced to death. And that decision would force everyone in that courtroom to confront an impossible question. What do you do with someone who has shown you beyond any doubt that they are capable of unspeakable evil and feel nothing but amusement at the suffering they caused? The sentencing phase was about to begin. Families would testify about their loss. Experts would debate Wade's mental state. And Wade's himself would sit there, watching it all unfold, still smirking, still detached, still playing his role as the untouchable villain who had somehow convinced himself that none of this was real. But it was real. Christine Melton was real. Diane Ruiz was real. Their family's pain was real. And the decision facing that jury was the most real thing any of them would ever have to make.
So before we move forward, I need you to do something. Stop and think about what you've just heard. Think about the phone call. Think about Stephen Testaseca's choice. Think about two women who showed kindness to a stranger and paid for it with their lives. And then tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were on that jury? Would you choose life in prison or would you choose death? Because your answer says something profound about who you are and what you believe justice really means. And if this story has gripped you the way it should, hit that subscribe button now, because the next part of this story is even more shocking. The sentencing, the reaction, and the question that still haunts everyone who followed this case. Did Wade Wilson finally understand what he'd done, or was he still smiling all the way to death row? The trial was over. Wade Wilson had been found guilty on all counts. But in that courtroom, as deputies prepared to take him away, nobody felt relief. Because everyone knew the hardest part was still coming. The jury now had to answer a question that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Should Wade Stephen Wilson live, or should he die? And here's what makes this so gut-wrenching. There was no good answer. Whatever they decided, two women would still be dead. Two families would still be destroyed. And somewhere, in a cell, Wade Wilson would still be smiling. So let me ask you this. If you had to make that choice right now, knowing everything you know, what would you decide? Life or death? Comment your answer below, because by the end of this story, you might change your mind. The sentencing phase began with victim impact statements. Christine Melton's family took the stand first. Her loved ones described a woman who lit up every room she entered, who had dreams and plans and people who needed her. They talked about the hole in their lives that would never be filled, the holidays that would never feel whole again, the milestones she'd never see. And as they spoke, many of them broke down. Not quiet tears, but the kind of raw, guttural sobbing that comes from a grief so deep it has no bottom. They looked directly at Wade Wilson as they testified, and he looked back at them with that same unsettling calmness, that same faint trace of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Then Diane Ruiz's family spoke. They talked about a mother, a daughter, a friend who'd been taken in the most brutal way imaginable. They described the horror of learning how she died, of knowing that she'd been left on the side of the road like trash, that she'd been run over again and again by someone who felt nothing. One family member said something that silenced the entire courtroom. She was still alive when he decided to run her over. She might have survived. She might have come home to us. But he made sure she couldn't. He made sure the last thing she experienced on this earth was unimaginable pain. And for what? For nothing. Just because he wanted to. If you're feeling anger right now, you're not alone. If you're wondering how anyone could defend Wade Wilson after hearing that testimony, you're asking the same question the prosecution wanted the jury to ask. And if this story is making you feel something deep in your chest, something you can't quite put into words, hit that like button right now, because that feeling, that's your humanity, that's your soul recognizing evil when it sees it. And we need more of that in this world. The defense put on their case for mercy. They called psychologists who testified about Wade's troubled childhood, his history of drug abuse, his brain injuries from past incidents. They argued that Wade was a product of his environment, that he'd never had a fair shot at life, that his brain was wired differently, and he couldn't control his impulses the way a healthy person could. They brought in family members who testified that Wade had been a good kid once, that he'd played sports, that he'd been charming and funny and full of potential. They begged the jury not to take his life, to give him a chance at rehabilitation, to show mercy, even if Wade himself had shown none.
And then the prosecution stood up for their closing argument. The lead prosecutor looked at each juror individually and said something that cut through every excuse, every justification, every attempt to explain away what Wade had done. This defendant made choices. He chose to strangle Christine Melton while she slept in her own bed. He chose to take her car. He chose to pick up Diane Ruiz. He chose to strangle her. And when he realized she was still alive, he chose to get back in that car and run over her body again and again until, in his own words, she looked like spaghetti. Those were choices, not mistakes, not accidents, not the result of a bad childhood or a brain injury or drug abuse. Choices. And when he called his father and confessed to everything he'd done, did he cry? Did he express any remorse? No. He bragged. He joked. He showed his father, and he's showing you right now exactly who he is, a man who kills for fun and feels nothing afterward. The prosecutor paused, and the courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Then they continued. The question before you is not whether Wade Wilson deserves sympathy. The question is whether Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz deserve justice. And if the answer is yes, then there is only one sentence that fits what this man has done: death. The jury left to deliberate. Hours turned into a full day. Families waited in the hallway, exhausted, emotionally drained, clinging to each other for support. Wade sat in a holding cell, apparently unbothered. His attorneys prepared for either outcome. And the world watched. Because by now, Wade Wilson's case had become a national story. Not because of what he'd done, though his crimes were horrific, but because of how he'd acted throughout the entire process. He'd become the face of something deeply disturbing in modern culture: the glamorization of killers, the romanticization of evil, the transformation of monsters into celebrities. Let me pause here and address something that needs to be said. During Wade Wilson's trial, thousands of people, mostly women, flooded social media with posts about how attractive they found him.
They sent him love letters. They called him misunderstood. They created fan pages. They argued that he deserved a second chance, that he could be saved, that maybe the right person could love the evil out of him. And I need you to understand how deeply messed up that is. Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz are dead. They were strangled. One of them was run over repeatedly until her body was unrecognizable, and people were sending heart emojis to the man who did it. If that doesn't disturb you, if that doesn't make you question what's happened to our society, then I don't know what will. Tell me in the comments right now, what do you think causes this phenomenon? Why do some people romanticize killers? Is it ignorance? Is it mental illness? Is it something darker? I genuinely want to know what you think, because this isn't just about Wade Wilson anymore. This is about all of us. The jury returned. The four persons stood, holding a piece of paper that contained a decision 12 people had agonized over. The judge asked for the verdict, and the four-person read aloud, "We, the jury, recommend that Wade Stephen Wilson be sentenced to death for the murder of Christine Melton. We, the jury, recommend that Wade Stephen Wilson be sentenced to death for the murder of Diane Ruiz." Death. Twice. One for each life he'd taken. The courtroom erupted. Some people gasped, others cried. The victims' families embraced each other, sobbing with a mixture of relief and grief that only they could understand. Because even though the jury had chosen death, it didn't bring Christine and Diane back. It didn't undo the horror. It didn't erase the pain. Justice had been served, but it tasted bitter.
And Wade, for the first time in the entire trial, his expression changed. The smirk faded. His face went blank. He stared straight ahead, not at the jury, not at his lawyers, not at the families, but at nothing. Just emptiness. Some people said he looked shocked. Others said he looked defeated. But a few observers, people who'd watched him closely throughout the trial, said something different. They said he looked like someone who'd finally realized that the game was over and he'd lost. But the sentencing wasn't official yet. That decision belonged to the judge. And on sentencing day, the courtroom filled once again. Families, reporters, curious onlookers, all there to witness the final chapter of Wade Wilson's story. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. They reviewed the evidence, the jury's recommendation, the aggravating and mitigating factors, and then they spoke directly to Wade Wilson. The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder. The judge's voice was firm, unwavering. Accordingly, it is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced as follows. Count 1. First-degree murder of Christine Melton. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. A pause. The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke. And then the judge continued. Count 2. First-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Wade Wilson sat perfectly still. His jaw clenched. His eyes blinked slowly as if he were trying to process information his brain couldn't accept. The deputies moved to escort him out of the courtroom. And as they led him away, cameras captured one final image. Wade Wilson, the man who'd smiled and smirked his way through a double murder trial, walking toward death row with a face that finally showed a flicker of understanding. He was transferred to Florida State Prison, where death row inmates spend their days in solitary confinement, isolated from the general population. Waiting for appeals, waiting for years to pass, waiting for the day when the state of Florida would carry out his sentence and end his life the same way he'd ended Christine's and Diane's. But even on death row, Wade didn't stay quiet. He gave interviews. He wrote letters. And in those communications, he did something that shocked even the people who thought they'd seen everything. He claimed he was innocent.
Not innocent in the sense that someone else had committed the crimes, but innocent in the sense that his confessions had been misunderstood, that he'd been coerced, that the system had railroaded him. He painted himself as a victim. And somewhere out there, people believed him. Because that's what happens when society turns killers into celebrities. The truth stops mattering. Let me take you back to something Stephen Tesseseca said during his testimony, something that's haunted me since I first heard it. When the prosecutor asked Stephen if Wade had shown any remorse during their jail visit, Stephen shook his head and said, "No, ma'am." Then he described how Wade had talked about the murders casually, almost proudly, referring to Christine with a slur, describing Diane's death in gruesome detail. And Stephen's voice broke when he said, "He told me she looked like spaghetti." Think about that phrase for a moment. Looked like spaghetti. That's not the language of someone who lost control. That's not the language of someone who made a mistake. That's the language of someone who enjoyed what they did. Someone who saw another human being's destroyed body and thought it resembled food. That level of detachment, that level of cruelty, it's almost incomprehensible. And yet it's real. Wade Wilson is real. His victims are real. And the evil he represents? That's real too.
So now we come to the question that everyone asks, but nobody wants to answer. Was Wade Wilson born this way, or did something happen to him that turned him into a killer? The defense argued that his brain was damaged, that drugs and trauma had broken something inside him. The prosecution argued that Wade was simply evil, that some people are just wired wrong and no amount of therapy or medication can fix them. And honestly, I don't know which answer is more terrifying. If Wade was born this way, then evil is just a random mutation, something that can appear in any family, in any neighborhood, without warning. But if Wade was made this way, if his environment and experiences turned him into a monster, then that means any of us could become him, under the right or wrong circumstances. Comment below and tell me what you believe. Nature or nurture? Born evil or made evil? Because your answer reveals something about how you see the world and whether you think people like Wade Wilson can ever be saved. Here's what I know for certain. Christine Melton deserved better. She deserved to wake up the next morning, go to work, see her family, live the rest of her life. Diane Ruiz deserved better. She deserved to walk down that road safely, to go home, to hug her children, to grow old. They both showed kindness to a stranger, and it cost them everything. And that's the real tragedy here. Not Wade Wilson's pathetic attempts to play the victim, not the bizarre online fan club that formed around him, but the fact that two good people are gone forever because one bad person decided their lives didn't matter. The families of Christine and Diane have to live with this every single day. They wake up and their loved one is still gone. They see Wade Wilson's face in the news and on social media, and they're reminded all over again of what he did. They watch people call him attractive, call him misunderstood, and they have to stomach the reality that their loved one's killer has fans. Imagine that. Imagine losing someone you love in the most horrific way possible, and then watching strangers defend the person who killed them. If you can't imagine that, then you're lucky. But the families of Christine and Diane don't have to imagine it. They live it every single day. As I'm wrapping up the story, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. First, evil exists. It's not a religious concept or a philosophical abstraction. It's a real thing that real people do to other real people. Wade Wilson is proof of that. Second, we as a society have a responsibility to remember the victims, not glamorize the killers. Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz should be the names we remember, not Wade Stephen Wilson. And third, justice is complicated. Some people believe the death penalty is wrong no matter what. Others believe it's the only appropriate punishment for crimes like this. I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I am here to tell you that if we don't have serious conversations about cases like this, about how we respond to evil, about how we prevent it from happening again, then we're failing the next potential victim. Thank you for following Wade Wilson's story to the end.
If this case moved you, hit that subscribe button now because we have more stories that deserve to be heard. Stories about victims who deserve justice and families who deserve support. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theory in the comments. Tell me what you think should happen to Wade Wilson. Tell me how you'd explain this case to someone who'd never heard of it. Tell me if you think Stephen Testaseca did the right thing by turning in his own son. And most importantly, tell me you'll remember Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. Because at the end of the day, this story isn't really about Wade Wilson at all. It's about them. It always was. One final question before you go, and I need you to really think about this. If you could ask Wade Wilson one question, knowing he'd have to answer honestly, what would you ask him? Would you ask why he did it? Would you ask if he feels remorse now? Would you ask what he was thinking during those final moments before he took each woman's life? Comment your question below. And if you found value in this video, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because true crime isn't entertainment, it's education, it's empathy. It's making sure that victims are never forgotten and that evil is always called by its name. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never forget that the person sitting next to you, the person who seems perfectly normal, might be hiding something you can't even imagine. That's not paranoia. That's reality. And Wade Wilson proved it.